Elian watched the sunrise paint the jagged peaks of the Andes in hues of fire and gold. It was a view that had cost him everything. 3 years ago he had stood on this very same ridge, not as a solitary figure, but as the leader of a team of 12. They were the Condors, the most celebrated high-altitude mountain guide service in South America, and Elian Valenzuela was their legend. He had been 32, at the absolute pinnacle of his career. His smile was as famous as his stamina, his optimism as boundless as the sky. He had summited Aconcagua more times than he could count, led first-time climbers up the peaks of Bolivia, and rescued more stranded mountaineers than the local authorities. His life was a testament to willpower, a story he told to wide-eyed clients over steaming cups of coca tea. The mountain, he would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners, doesn't care about your plans. It only respects your preparation and your heart. On that terrible day, his own heart had betrayed him, not with fear, but with a decision. Leading a group of 4 wealthy Americans up a technically challenging new route on a lesser-known peak, they'd been caught in a sudden, violent whiteout. The world dissolved into a screaming, frozen chaos of wind and snow. Visibility dropped to zero. They were forced to dig in, huddling in a snow cave for 2 days as the storm raged. On the third morning, the clouds parted, revealing a cruel, beautiful blue sky. But the storm had taken its toll. One of the clients, a man named Richard, was suffering from severe altitude sickness and early-stage frostbite in his toes. They were at 19,000 feet. The summit was only 1,500 feet above them. It was tantalizingly close. The other 3 clients, driven by the immense financial and personal investment in the expedition, looked at Elian. "Can we go for it?" they asked. "We can leave Richard here with one guide. We're so close." Elian looked at Richard, his face gray with sickness, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and terror. He looked at the other 3, their faces pinched with ambition. He looked at the pristine, corniced ridge leading to the summit, glittering in the morning sun, so deceptively peaceful. The mountain didn't care about their investment. It didn't care about their dreams. It only respected the truth of the situation. "We're turning back," Elian said. His voice was calm, but it carried the finality of an avalanche. The protests were immediate and fierce. Arguments about money, about planning, about the weather window. Elian listened, then spoke again. "Richard's condition will worsen, not improve, at this altitude. If we go up, we might not have the strength or the time to get him down alive. My decision is final. We descend." The descent was a silent, bitter affair. The Americans felt cheated. Elian felt the weight of their disappointment, but a deeper, quieter part of him felt the clean, cold satisfaction of a correct decision. They got Richard to a lower altitude, to a helicopter, and to a hospital in Mendoza. He lost 2 toes, but he kept his life. The other 3 clients, however, returned home and wrote scathing online reviews. They accused him of a lack of ambition, of cowardice, of ruining their trip of a lifetime. The story, embellished and twisted, spread through the international climbing community. Bookings dried up. The Condors, his beloved company, folded within a year. His wife, Sophia, a woman whose love was as steady as the earth itself, had stood by him. "You did the right thing, Elian," she'd said, her hand in his. "The mountain will always remember." But the world had a shorter memory. Elian retreated from guiding, from the town, from the life he'd known. He took odd jobs, his spirits slowly eroding under the weight of the unjust failure. He watched his savings dwindle, saw the concern in Sophia's eyes, and felt the first true doubts of his life. Had he been wrong? Should he have pushed on? The question became a splinter in his mind, festering. Then, a year later, Sophia got sick. A virus attacked her heart, leaving it weakened and unreliable. The medical bills were staggering. Elian sold his gear, his prized collection of ice axes and ropes, to pay for the first round of treatments. He worked double shifts at a construction site in Santiago, his hands calloused from holding steel instead of ice, his lungs filled with dust instead of thin, crystalline air. The man who had once danced on the roof of the Americas now trudged through a valley of concrete and despair. He felt buried alive. Sophia, frail but with an unbroken spirit, would watch him come home, exhausted and silent. One evening, she took his face in her hands. You're not here, Elian. You're still on that mountain. You need to find your way down. He broke down then, the story of the failed expedition, the lost company, the broken dream pouring out of him in a hoarse confession. He told her about the doubt that gnawed at him. She listened, her gaze unwavering. Then she pointed a thin finger at a photograph on the wall. It was Elian, 25 years old, on his first solo summit of Aconcagua. He looked impossibly young and possibly alive. You didn't lose your company because you turned back, she said softly. You lost it because you told the truth. And the truth is a hard summit for some people to reach. But you, my love, you know how to reach summits. And right now, our summit is getting me well. This is our mountain, and we climb it together. Her words were a rope thrown into his abyss. The summit wasn't a geographical point on a map. It was a hospital bill, a prescription, a day without pain. It was a series of small, unglamorous victories. He had been so focused on the peak he'd failed to reach that he'd forgotten how to climb the mountain right in front of him. He started climbing again, but in a new way. He began by climbing out of bed an hour earlier to make Sophia a proper breakfast. He climbed by negotiating with the hospital, his calm, authoritative guide's voice returning as he argued for better payment plans. He climbed by researching her condition, becoming an expert in the landscape of her illness, learning its routes and its dangers. He climbed by finding a small, part-time job at an outdoor gear shop in the city. He wasn't guiding, but he was talking about the mountains again, and the old light began to flicker in his eyes. One day, a young man came into the shop, looking for advice on a winter ascent of a local peak. He was nervous, under-equipped, and full of the reckless enthusiasm Elian remembered so well. Elian spent an hour with him, not just selling him gear, but teaching him. He drew routes on a napkin, explained the importance of layering, the signs of frostbite, the humility required to turn back. The young man left, armed with knowledge and a sense of respect for the mountain he hadn't had before. The shop owner, an old climber named Ignacio who knew Elian's story, watched the exchange. You've still got it, he said. It's just talking, Elian shrugged. It's not just talking, Ignacio replied. It's guiding. The mountain is just a different one now. That night, Elian told Sophia about the encounter. A slow smile spread across her face. You sing, she whispered. The mountain hasn't forgotten you. The years that followed were a long, steady grind. There were setbacks, frightening episodes where Sophia's health would dip, plunging them back into a crevasse of fear and financial worry. There were moments when Elian felt the old despair creeping back, a numbing cold in his spirit. But now he had a new set of tools. He had the memory of Sophia's words. He had the discipline of the small, daily climb. He learned to find satisfaction not in the grand summit, but in the successful completion of a single day. He started doing more informal guiding at the shop, leading free weekend clinics on navigation and safety in the foothills outside the city. His students were not wealthy foreigners, but local kids, university students, ordinary people with a dream. He charged them nothing, asking only for their attention and their respect for the hills. He became a local legend again, but a different kind. Not the famous guide who conquered peaks, but the quiet man in the worn-out jacket who taught people how to come home safely. Sophia got better. It was a slow, arduous process, but her heart strengthened and the color returned to her cheeks. The financial burden eased, not because of a single stroke of luck, but because of years of small, consistent payments. They were out of the death zone. They were descending to safer ground. Then, 3 years after that fateful day on the mountain, Elian received an email. It was from Richard, the client he had carried down. He had tracked Elian down through the gear shop. Elian, it read. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for the part my silence played in what happened to you after the expedition. I was sick and then I was ashamed. I let the others tell their story because it was easier than facing my own weakness. But I've never forgotten. You gave me my life. I've climbed a dozen mountains since then, safely, with my 2.5 feet. I became a guide myself, teaching others. I owe it all to the lesson you taught me, that the true summit is the one you reach with everyone in your party. I've spent 3 years trying to find a way to repay you. I think I finally have. Attached was a link to a crowdfunding campaign. Richard had set it up, telling the true story of that day in stunning, honest detail. He named the other clients, not with anger, but with a plea for them to see the truth. He called Elian the bravest man I have ever met. The campaign's goal was to raise enough money for Elian to reopen the condors. Elian stared at the screen, tears streaming down his face. Sophia came up behind him, reading over his shoulder. She squeezed his hand. Within a week, the campaign had gone viral. Donations poured in from climbers all over the world who had heard the false story and were now learning the truth. The three other clients, humbled by the public narrative, each made substantial donations and wrote personal apologies. A few months later, a small, refurbished office in the foothills of the Andes opened its doors. A simple wooden sign hung above it, the Condors, high-altitude mountain guides. Elian Valenzuela, lead guide. The first official expedition was a charity climb, led by Elian, with a special assistant guide named Richard by his side. They weren't going for a record-breaking peak. They were taking a group of young people from underprivileged backgrounds on their first real mountain journey. On the final night of that trip, Elian sat by a campfire at 15,000 feet. The sky was a velvet blanket embroidered with a billion stars. He looked at the faces of the kids, alight with wonder and exhaustion. He looked at Richard, who was grinning like a fool. He thought of Sophia, safe and warm in their home down in the valley. He understood now that his life was not one story, but a range of mountains. There was the peak of his early fame, the harrowing descent into the valley of shame, the long, grueling climb through the shadow of illness, and finally, this new, sunlit ridge he was on. The mountain he had failed to summit that day had not been the end of him. It had been the beginning of everything that mattered. It had taught him that the greatest summit isn't the one you stand on, but the one you help others reach. And sometimes, the most heroic climb isn't the one you make to the top, but the long, slow, determined one you make back to yourself.